Until now, you learned a lot about components, data binding, and so on. And of course, you did this because it is the core of each Angular 2 application. However, as I already said before, components are just directives. So in the end, directives are the core of each application. How does that make sense? Well, directives are just the instructions, like components, like the selectors you saw in the HTML code, which tell Angular 2 what to do in certain places of your code. So like you had the tag identifying your component, that Angular 2 should render your component in the place of this tag. This tag was just a directive telling Angular 2, hey, render my component, my view here, in this place. So it was an instruction, a directive in the end. Therefore, directives are a key part which not only allow you in the form of components to render views or code, HTML code, but also to change the general appearance or structure of your DOM. Let's have a look at them. Directives are instructions, as I already said. This means that in the code you will find something like this. ng4, for example, is a built-in directive, which basically tells Angular 2, loop through all items and in each iteration assign a current element to a variable called item. Also replicate the li element for each iteration. So this little thing here, ng4 followed by the expression between the quotation marks, tells Angular 2 all that. And of course, this is a very easy and short way to quickly output data in the DOM, because as you might guess, what ng4 does is it repeats this list item and inserts the value of the current item of the current iteration as a value between the opening and closing list item tag. So this would be one example for a built-in directive for such an instruction. Now, as you learned, a component is just another instruction. Here, the instruction for Angular 2 is create a component of the selected type and render the view, the template, of the component into this place. So both examples here are directives telling Angular 2 what to do. Now, besides components, like for example ng4, we have attribute and structural directives. Attribute directives interact with the element on which they sit, to put it that way. So they are applied like an attribute, that's where the name comes from, to an HTML element and change its style, its appearance, add some click listeners, whatever. So they interact with the very element on which they sit. Examples would be ng-class and ng-style, which you already saw in prior lectures. They are, as I said, named attribute directives because they are applied like attributes. And don't get confused by the brackets here. Brackets are not necessarily a part of attribute directives. The attribute directive is simply the ng-class. The brackets only come into play because ng-class in this example is a directive which needs an input, which uses property binding. But Angular 2 also offers directives which don't need input, which don't have property binding. So the directive is really only the thing between the brackets. The brackets are only there for property binding. Don't mix those two things up. An attribute directive doesn't have to have squared brackets because they don't have to have property or event binding. Structural directives are named that way because they change the structure of the DOM or the HTML code. So they not only interact with the element on which they sit, but with the whole view container, and they change, well, the structure. Examples here of built-in directives would be ngIf and ng4. ngIf conditionally attaches or detaches an element. It not only hides it, it really attaches or detaches it. And ng4, well, creates a couple of elements depending on the number of iterations. So this is the name why they are named structural directives.